Chapter 34 Workers harming other workers was a core component of the theme of the rescue, and what better way for Carousel to remind us of that than by having one scab be unwilling to save another. Michael tried to be a hero in the wrong story, and now our hopes of saving the real player he represented were gone, for a time at least. Underlying Dinah's rescue trop's promises of safety was the reality that it was extremely difficult to succeed with. It wasn't that you would die trying. It was that the logistics of getting a bunch of NPCs to survive was legitimately challenging to do. That was the cost. That was the price of having such a safe run. It was hard to get to the end. Everyone was deflated after Michael died. We had hoped that we could avoid losing one of our central NPCs for a second blood, but we had not earned it. We had been on a roll of finding solution after solution, but we were too slow. Whatever hope we had built up from our successes felt like it was gone. But Antoine wouldn't let us give up. "Come on, people. We still have 2 players to rescue here. It's time to focus up and take it down the home stretch," he said. Then he kept saying things like that, and I basically ignored him as I weighed our chances. That type of pep only made me nervous. There was so much distance between the surrogates and the helm, and it was the finale already. For all of our successes, I just felt like the pressure was bubbling over. First, we had to find the next puzzle, then we had to find a way to solve it, and then we had to convince these surrogates to crack the puzzle in a timely manner. No matter what we did, they would bog things down with character drama. I knew we were supposed to do stuff like that, too, when we were doing storylines. I knew we were supposed to talk about Hartakas and suffering, but watching how much on-screen time it was taking was driving me crazy. Lila eventually crawled all the way across the platform to where Andrew was, but he was so disgusted he couldn't look at her. She could say that she was afraid as much as she wanted, but the truth was she could easily have saved Michael. She had a good grip and was unlikely to be at risk. Andrew's character surrogate tried to hide his disdain and think analytically, as always, but I could hear a sharpness in his voice, a disappointment, a distrust. "We don't have that much further," he said. "Once we get to the helm, we should be able to make contact with those who will help us. We might even be able to override the system manually." They still didn't know the ship was running out of fuel, not until the red lights started blaring. Bobby had suggested it, but it felt like we had missed an important scene where they were supposed to learn how important it was to get to the helm. Because of the modular design, the front half of the ship was just as haphazard as the back half. One of the first rooms they came across was the other sleeping bay. This room had a fraction as many people in it, but they were just as infected, if not more, than all of the passengers in the original starting room. Antoine, Kimberly, and I checked it out. We didn't find any meaningful plot elements there. I was sure that Andrew would take time to mourn them. That was his nature. Lila barely got past the doorway and didn't look around. "I have to imagine that this is where it started," Andrew said. "Why do you say that?" Lila asked. "The infestation is older here, you can tell. There are more insect casings, evidence that they've been here longer." Lila looked across the room at the infested deep sleep chambers. They continued to exchange dialogue, basically running through their exposition long enough for Bobby to catch up with them. "Where's Michael? Is he what I saw in the phase ballast juncture?" Bobby asked. Neither of them answered, but that seemed to be enough of an answer for Bobby, who, of course, already knew what had happened. "Oh, you shouldn't have gone across without me," he said. "I told you I would be right back. I had to check on my livestock." "It's too late now," Andrew said. "We just have to get to the helm." Red lights started to flash all over the ship, and Bobby quickly explained, "Just as I feared. We're running out of fuel. We're supposed to make a fuel stop soon, but in order to do that, we need to get to the controls." Andrew nodded. Lila did not respond. Yet, they kept talking instead of moving. Back on the Helio, the rest of us were working non-stop, trying to foresee what puzzles were coming up so that we could find solutions. Luckily, the next puzzle was one that Carousel must have been proud of because it didn't even try to hide it. The only way forward was through a room called the plasma grid. Because I thought Ibex's explanation was a little convoluted, I had to spend extra time figuring out exactly what the puzzle was. The room was not meant to be traversed by humans. There were floating streams of plasma shooting between coils at various places across the room. It was a laser maze. The conduits that controlled them had to be moved around depending on the power needs of the ship, and since humans couldn't do that without getting injured, somehow Ibex was doing it, but it wasn't clear how. Even he wouldn't tell me. Yes, Ibex kept some secrets. He had some way of manipulating things inside the ship, some arms or something. We had not seen them because we had not pushed the story in that direction. I had to assume that we did not want to see Ibex as a full-fledged antagonist. I preferred him as an obstacle. Or at least I thought I did. So, we had to get a look at the plasma grid. It wasn't a long trip. We passed by Lila and Andrew, who were dealing with the fallout from Michael's death, and Bobby failed to convince them to move ahead. As we gazed into the room, we quickly realized how dangerous it was. The plasma was like living lightning, zapping between metal rods in a room with a shallow ceiling. The only other ways forward were locked for good. This was all that was left. As we entered the room, it was dark and glowing, and it strangely reminded me of a laser tag arena. The goal was absurd. In order to change where the plasma beams were, you had to change where the power on the ship was being allocated at any given time. When that occurred, Ibex would change where the conduits were, possibly giving a safe path for a human to walk across. Essentially, you turned off some lights and turned others on to make a pathway across the room. It was frustrating because this wasn't a test of savvy. It was a test of actual intelligence. There might have been a way to use savvy here, but I was missing it. Ibex would explain things but not help us. Still, we had to try. How in the world are we supposed to explain this to the NPCs? Antoine asked as we both looked around the death trap, which was the plasma grid. We just tell Bobby how to do it and do our best not to rely on those surrogates, I said. Andrew was smart. He may be able to understand it, but it's a gamble. I couldn't help but feel that the puzzle we were facing was more of a punishment for refusing to engage with the storytelling aspect of the game and trying to solve the problems as if this were some high-priced Rubik's Cube. We wanted this story to be about the puzzles, and Carousel listened. This was the granddaddy of all puzzles. We can do this, Ant-Man said. You can figure this out, right? I mean, this reminds me of the type of games that you'd play on your phone. You know what I mean? Yeah, arbitrary nonsense. But without second chances, I said. I may have been more wooden than I intended. He got close to me. What's going on? Are you giving up? He asked. I looked out over the plasma arrays. Even if we showed them the perfect solution, could we trust that they would actually follow our plans without the drama? Or would they end up dying to increase tension? I think we made the wrong play, I said. We focused on solving the puzzle aspect. We should have focused on the themes. I don't even think this room would be here if we had done that. Well, it is here, Ant-Man said, and it's the only way we're getting across, so we have to solve the problem in front of us. Pep talks don't work for complex logic puzzles, I said, staring down at the control panel, which only served as a rudimentary map of where the power was going. We need to lower power to the starboard quarter, the room with all of the sleeping passengers. Antoine looked over the map. I'm not following, he said. It looks more like we have to disengage anti-gravity to forge a path to the middle, then do something to shut down this part. Lowering power to the sleeping bays will kill some passengers. Listen to me, I said. The theme is about workers hurting workers. Lowering the power in the sleeping bay doesn't solve the problem as it's presented to us. In fact, the only way to solve the problem is to go all over the ship, switching on lights here, switching off lights there, turning on some machines, turning off others, and disconnecting entire modules. It would take hours, and even then, if Ibex fought us, it would be impossible. He thought about what I was saying. So, we have them play into the theme, I said. If we get Andrew in here or Bobby to look down at this panel and say that the only way across is to turn off power to all of those deep sleep chambers with the passengers and then bicker over the consequences of that, I think it'll work. The alternative was that we put the NPCs inside this plasma room, and with one wrong move, they would get cut in half, and there would undoubtedly be wrong moves. Andrew was not going to sacrifice passengers for himself, Ant-Man said. He's too nice. If he was a player, we could use that strategy, and it would work easily, but Surrogate Andrew would never do that. He was right. A player would be able to give up their claims of compassion and do the evil thing if it meant survival. The Surrogates, however, would never. They were immovable when it came to character. I have no idea what Carousel wants or if it's trying to do one thing or another. I know that we are not realistically going to be able to solve this plasma grid with the time we have left on the story trying to puppet those surrogates around. Antoine didn't like it. I could tell from his face. Getting to the front of the ship was a concrete goal, and even though the puzzles were tricky to figure out and solve, it was easy to conceptualize. What I was suggesting would subvert everything. I wish it could be Andrew, I said. He's the one that's been worried about harm to the passengers. He gets the choice to either save himself and cause suffering to a bunch of other people or to spare them and die with them. It makes sense. He's been talking about his regret over losing his medical license. He's got to lean into it, be the bad guy. That would be a fitting end for the story. Workers hurting workers. He won't do it, so Lila's our best choice. We give her a chance. She'll push the button to save herself. Andrew will finally abandon her to her fate, but he'll have that much more motivation to make it to the helm. You think that'll work? Ant-Man asked. We haven't been able to predict what these surrogates will do when push comes to shove. At this point, I don't know, but it will use the themes to solve the puzzle instead of logic. It is a real pivotal final moment. Everything comes down to one horrible decision. And what if they don't make that decision? Ant-Man asked. What if she isn't willing to sacrifice all of the passengers? We lose, I said. We don't have enough time left in the movie to come up with a plan C. Every tick of the plot cycle was like an earthquake. If we tried to solve puzzles, it would take too long, and after this, there would be more puzzles. As far as I could tell, there were at least 2 other potential obstacles between where we were and the helm. If we made the story about puzzles, we would have to beat those, too. But this story wasn't about the challenge of solving Ibex's strange engineering. It was a story about scabs. And Lila was a scab. She took someone's job who was trying to advocate for the very safety measures that might have saved the passengers aboard the Ibex. The irony was thick. The story had a clear political message to tell. It didn't matter if it was preachy or if it was correct. Carousel had made numerous mistakes, and someone had to pay for them. This isn't a sure thing, I said. We make sure everyone stays on the Helio, Ant-Man said. Give Bobby his instructions and let it rip. I nodded and silently wondered if Ant-Man had played with Beyblades growing up. We have to push forward, Bobby said. In front of this should be the plasma relay. All we have to do is switch off some power around the ship to build a path across the grid. Unless, of course, you've got some dynamite to blow open these doors. Plasma relays? That's dangerous, Andrew said. You're sure there's no other way? The only other way is that we put on spacesuits and crawl outside, but in case you haven't noticed, Ibex would probably get in the way of that, too. Andrew nodded. We need to find where Lila wandered off to. We need to stick together. You're right, Bobby said. We need all the help we can get. Andrew paused. Michael and I promised to bring her to safety. Even when we struggled, saving her helped us focus. Maybe it is a weakness that common men only find meaning through others. It was second nature. It was a purpose. It was the thing Michael died trying to accomplish. Do you think that was a mistake? Putting his life on the line for someone who would never do the same for him? Bobby threw up his hands. I don't know, man, but we have to get there quick because we have to make progress, or else we'll be adrift in space forever. They were running out of time. I didn't even know what would happen if the final battle came before they were ready to meet it. Would a battle of some nature materialize? Would the film just stop? Andrew nodded again. The finale was nearing its climax, and the story was spinning its wheels. We watched from the helm of the Helio as Bobby did everything he could to move the story forward. The search for Lila did not take long. She was inside a room near the secondary sleeping bay, a large room filled with storage containers, all alphabetized. As Bobby and Andrew walked into the room, it was clear that Lila had found one of the cubbies and had opened it up. "What is that?" Andrew asked as he and Bobby took Lila by surprise. The containers were filled with the belongings of all the passengers. Lila had found hers and had taken what appeared to be a baby blanket in her hands, holding it to her chest. "How did you get that aboard?" Andrew said. "We were not supposed to bring fabrics of any kind onto the Ibex." She didn't answer, but from what I could see on the screen, it looked like she had snuck it inside the lining of her duffel bag, which was very similar to the duffel bags we had all been given. "There's nothing wrong with it," Lila said. "I just want to remember my baby." "I don't care what you want to remember. Bringing fabrics onto the ship risks bringing contaminants and infestations like bedbugs," Andrew said. "It wasn't me," Lila said. "I washed it before I brought it. This couldn't have been me. Besides, it's been in my storage container this entire time. There was nothing on it." "You could have easily brought an infestation of bedbugs," Andrew said. "All it takes is one to crawl its way out of your storage container and lay eggs." "Look, it's clean," Lila said. "It doesn't matter," Andrew insisted. "You did it. Dozens of other people probably did it, and one of you is the one who brought those things aboard. You're all equally culpable as far as I'm concerned. People are dead or maimed. Michael. He died. Andrew, I just wanted a piece of her with me. We're going to be gone for 10 years. We're going to be gone forever," Andrew said, "because you and people like you can't follow the rules. Because you're not considerate. You didn't think about other people." "Guys," Bobby said, "I think we should move forward. We can argue about this once we get to the helm." But Andrew and Lila ignored him. "Really?" Lila said. "We're inconsiderate? Last time I checked, someone was unemployed because you decided to be here instead, just like the rest of us. And you think you're better than the rest of us?" I rolled my eyes. They were giving their little speeches, and they had no time left. This was the point where we should have been in the final battle, which would take the form of Andrew's decision to disconnect the power to the deep sleep pods. Instead, the final battle was going to be an argument because we had not succeeded. "Bobby needs to get them to that room now." "This is not what they should be doing," I said. I had no way of communicating with Bobby except one because they were on screen. I asked Ibex to give me a camera view of the plasma chamber, and I used my insert shot drop on the control panel because I knew that would alert Bobby and give that object a small amount of importance. It could shift the narrative. Bobby took my cue and ran up, grabbed Lila by the elbow, and said, "We can talk about this nonsense later. We have to move forward." Andrew was still seething, and they all immediately went off-screen. Unlike the party phase and rebirth, which took days of in-story time, if not actual days of real-time time, the finale would be over in a matter of minutes. Bobby practically dragged Lila to the plasma chamber. Andrew continued to lay into her. When they got to the plasma room, Bobby started looking over the control panel, and he said, "Oh God, I've been looking at this, and I think the only way for us to disengage the plasma and find a path forward is to turn off the power to the primary deep sleep bay." Andrew looked at him in horror. "No, we can't do that," he said. "Without power, the passengers will be ejected from deep sleep. Many of them will not survive, and those that do will be in horrific pain from anaphylaxis and anemia, not to mention infection and the sheer horror of their circumstances. We have to make a decision," Bobby said. "We don't live if we don't make it to the helm, and the only way to the helm is to disconnect power to those deep sleep chambers. Come on, it's not your fault, it's just their bad luck. What do you think, Lila?" She was crying into her baby blanket on the floor. "The only way to save yourself is to press this button," Bobby said. The button was just a prop. I could see on Andrew's face that we had understood him. While the narrative implied that his character had made unethical decisions in the past, up to and including crossing a picket line to take another person's job, which was an act the narrative condemned, he was entirely against this. Andrew shook his head. We can't do that. I was a doctor once. I pledged to do no harm, and I violated it. I can't do that again. Lila? Bobby asked. She looked at the button. The temptation was there. And then Andrew stepped in the way. I won't let you do this, he said. Not this time. Bobby, panicking, looked at the button. He shouldn't press it, Ramona said. Right? He shouldn't press it. I agreed. Bobby's character had a grudge against Carousel, but that was the only character work we had him work on. We simply didn't have time for more. He wasn't a scab. It couldn't be him. It wouldn't fit the story because he was not connected to the themes of the story. He had to know that. He wasn't a dummy. Pushing that button might do nothing, but it would certainly not work. This was pure improvisation, and his pressing the button was not meaningful enough for Carousel to go for it. He had to know that. He had to know. The lights went out on the ibex. The needle on the plot cycle moved forward. We were at the end. We had lost. Bobby. I screamed. He needed to get out of there. The cameras went off. Ibex, Ibex, do you hear me? I asked. I'm going to go get him, Antwan said as he jumped down from the bridge of the Helio. Just wait, I said. He's coming. He knows to get here as soon as possible. And he was. Before Antwan could get through the door, Bobby was there, stone-faced. Did we just lose? He asked. Yes, I said solemnly. You didn't press the button, right? He shook his head. It wasn't set up for my character. We had. We tried to treat the storyline as a puzzle, but we ran out of time. Our attempt to play into the themes at the last minute didn't matter. How embarrassing. My fears of failing everyone had finally come true. I was exposed. A fraud. The Atlas said Dinah's trap was hard to use well. How had I fooled myself into thinking we would be the exception? Chapter 35. When I opened my eyes, the sun was setting. I stood on the campus of the Carousel Powerworks Pavilion. The storyline was over. We didn't even get a visit from Silas, the mechanical showman. It's great to hear you had such a leisurely time, Trip, the NPC who guided us when we first arrived, said. He was standing right in front of us. It took a moment to orient myself. I looked around. The place was still populated, but it would soon return to its abandoned aesthetic when we left. We had lost, and in the blink of an eye, we were no longer in outer space. We were standing on a long red carpet while Trip told us how exciting our trip had been and how important it was for Carousel. I was so deflated that I could have dropped to my knees, but a numbness in my mind kept me from doing so. I could feel my disappointment, but it was distant. Well, anyway, Trip said, it was nice meeting you, and if you ever happen to win a trip to outer space again, I guess I'll be seeing you. He smiled and walked away. We just stood there for a moment, taking it all in. Isaac and Cassie hugged each other. So did Kimberly and Antwan. It felt like we were at a funeral. Heck, it felt almost like how dying feels. Well, that was something, Dinah said. Somehow, I still know a whole lot about connection ports on the Ibex Model 103P. If Dinah was trying to make a joke, the vibes must have really been off. She must have sensed our collective regret, disappointment, and grief over our loss. We had survived, and so had Bobby, even though he was far up ahead of us with his dogs on their leashes. But it was still surreal. One day, in the rescue that won't be so forgiving, we were going to experience that exact same thing, the story moving on without us. And then everything's going to go black, possibly after some ferocious act of violence against us. And then we'll just stop existing. And if it is anything like it will be my fault. We were too slow to solve the puzzles. That was my fault. I was the high-savvy character, the only one we had. We didn't play to the themes of the story, And that was explicitly my decision because I didn't know what to do to get the NPCs to go along with it. I still didn't know how to do that. The further the story went along, the harder it was to corral them. I didn't know how many mistakes I had made, but I knew they had started to pile up at the end. I didn't know how to improve just yet. I was numb. We failed our first rescue. Did this spell doom for our plans of saving everyone? Because that was the plan, we were going to journey into stories where survival was uncertain, where we would be outmatched and underleveled. That's what Project Rewind was about, giving us lots of rescues so that we could power level. Dinah's drop was supposed to be our safeguard. It had kept us safe, but otherwise, we failed. Survival was not the real goal, but it was all we managed. We had to thrive, or we would die here, inside a storyline or out, if we didn't escape. And to escape, we had to level up. The framers of Project Rewind had been clear. We needed to power level, we needed an invitee, which we already had, we needed a guide, whatever that was, we needed a secret keeper, we needed to stick to the plan, and we had no room for failure. Sure, this time, we all survived, but there would come a time when we didn't. If we couldn't defeat a storyline with bedbugs and a poorly programmed chatbot, how were we going to compete against all of the other horrors of the universe? The pressure felt physical. It felt like it was pressing on my lungs, weighing my face down, and daring my heart to burst. I couldn't stand it. I couldn't stand letting the others down. I had closed my eyes as soon as I had the wits to, and I had yet to open them. I just knew that the others were staring at me, that they knew now that I was going to get them killed. And now I had to focus because I was the only one who could safely shepherd them back to the loft. That was my job. Luckily, one skill I could always count on was not showing my emotions. I took a deep breath and opened my eyes. Isaac and Cassie were still talking to each other, whispering. I could see tears in Cassie's eyes. I could see absolutely nothing in Isaac's. As much as he wanted to pretend he was a cynic and a pessimist, I knew that he had built up a lot of hope for this rescue. Even though Cassie was the one crying, she was also the one comforting because she knew that beneath Isaac's blank gaze, he needed it. At least we know it's really Andrew, she said. How? Isaac asked. How would we possibly know he's actually here? His face on a reward poster doesn't mean anything. I'll believe we can save him when I see it. We did see it, Cassie said. Even though that wasn't his face, it was still him. You could tell he wanted to help those people, and he could never hurt them. I think that was Andrew in there. Didn't you feel him? Didn't you know? Tears streamed down her face, and Isaac didn't answer her, but he also didn't argue with her. I thought I saw a tear start to form in his eyes. That means he is here, she said. I don't know how, but he's here, and we can save him. How do you know? Isaac asked. They always say Carousel isn't a place with happy endings. How would they know? Cassie said. Nobody's been to the end yet. They continued back and forth. I stopped listening. Built-up tension and fear turned into tears and more than just Cassie's eyes as we walked back. In a way, we had gotten a taste of the worst that can happen. As we walked, we rejoined Bobby and his dogs. The dogs were excited to go on a walk and happy to see Bobby again. They wagged their tails and yipped excitedly, which I thought was a terrible failure to read the room. As we walked, I stopped and said, I'm sorry about that. I take full responsibility, so if you want to blame me, I'm not going to argue. I know I talk like I know what I'm doing all the time, but clearly. Look, I'm just trying my best. I know this is a huge setback because now we don't get all the bonus experience and rewards, even if we do succeed. So we're basically no further now than when we started, and that's my fault. While I spoke, I tried to deliver my words without any emotion because I really didn't want to sound like I was on some self-pity, everything is my fault rant, but from their reactions, I guess I failed. Because they hugged me. Kimberly and then Cassie, and Antoine gave me a pat on the back, and I don't know who else joined in because I froze. And then I turned away from them because I felt myself starting to get way too close to tears. and before anyone could comment on it, a sickening howl sounded from higher up the mountain, and whatever was on our minds, whatever moment was being had, it ended. Ant 1 had his baseball bat back, so he moved up in front of us. I didn't know if we should have been ashamed, but our reaction was to wait. We didn't try to run. No one but Ant 1 and Dinah pulled out weapons. We just waited to see if that howl preceded our doom. Even Bobby's dogs had quieted down and were paying rapt attention. One thought that entered my mind was that if a werewolf did come barreling down the mountain at us, we would at least get to know for sure what happened to the rest of Andrew's team. "Get ready to go back to Hitch," I said, my instincts taking over. We all backed away a few steps and waited. But the one howl was all there was. No giant wolf came to greet us. As usual, the monster lair was just there for the atmosphere, a howl as the moon rose to remind us that this was a place of horror. And the occasional bed bug. "This one hurts," Ant 1 said. "It sucks. We just got a better taste of our own mortality than when we actually die in storylines. Remember, this was the plan. We picked Dinah's drop because it gave us the best chance at surviving, and look, we survived. Everything's going according to plan. We have to stay positive and keep moving forward, one step at a time." I was beginning to wonder if Ant 1's speeches and motivational rants were more for him than they were for the rest of us, but then I saw that the others seemed to appreciate them. Yes, we had planned to maximize our chance of survival at the cost of increasing our chance of failing the storyline. It was calculated, but we were all hoping for a different outcome. "No regret or sorrow," Ant 1 said, "only hope for tomorrow." Okay, I wished he would stop. As soon as we got back to Kimberly's and everyone was safe, I made my way up to the roof so that I could be alone for a little bit as darkness fell. Of course, I had forgotten that Bobby had to return his dogs back up to the top of the roof, so he was up there, too, petting them and playing with them. But I could abide that. He could stay in his little world, and I would stay in mine. Except he was not the only person to follow me up. Ramona came, too. I went to the side of the roof and leaned onto the brick barrier that surrounded it, looking out over the city. The city was alive, like an ordinary town. It didn't care that we had just been defeated. Life and life moved on here, whether you willed it to or not. Ramona came and stood next to me, leaning up against the brick railing. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. "You all right?" she asked eventually. "Of course," I said. "Didn't you hear? Everything went according to plan." She laughed. "It honestly wasn't the worst vacation," she said. "We had a view and room service, at least until we threw away all the food." "I remember that being your idea," I said. "Well, you said we needed an emergency so that Ibex would let us make port. And I was already tired of slurping down those nutrient pouches." "Yeah," I said. "The apple cinnamon was okay, but the turkey dinner was the worst thing in the universe. I still don't understand some things about that run," she said. "Why didn't Kimberly's trap work well? I thought there was supposed to be some anti-scouting power, but you said there wasn't one. And I also don't understand why we were on a strange alien spaceship if that never came up in the story, or why we had a clone machine on it with us." "Mysteries of Carousel," I said. "Growing up, they said that Carousel spins in both directions, which meant that sometimes things don't make sense. Because a lot of things didn't make sense now that I think about it. To me, Carousel was just the state and city where I grew up, but now I get it. I had thought about those questions, too." "Kimberly's trap worked fine," I said. "Remember how I said Ibex had a trap that made Moxie checks use Savvy instead? Well, Kimberly's scouting trap with Sal uses Moxie, but because of Ibex, it used her Savvy stat, and she only has 1 point in Savvy. That's why it didn't work." Ramona started to laugh. "We were so confused about that. I still haven't told her, though. I think she may have figured it out," I said. "You know she's got that trap that allows her to transfer stat points when she puts her hair in a ponytail. So the reason that the trap failed, in a way, was that she didn't have her hair up." Ramona laughed again. And I think the reason that we got the advanced spaceship was part because of our tropes combos. But part was a warning against trying to just rescue the surrogates outright by putting them on our ship. Because no one in their right mind would think that our spaceship and the Ibex were from the same story. And I think that the cloning machine was just a place to keep Bobby's dogs where they would be safe. Oh. I see. But I don't think having your DNA on a cloning machine is the same as being safe, Ramona said. Well, at the very least, it allowed Carousel to fulfill Bobby's license without putting a bunch of dogs in outer space. Still, she said, it would have been cool if we could get it to work, maybe find a way to incorporate it. I mean, how often do you find a working cloning machine? In Carousel? I asked. Well, maybe. I guess there probably are other cloning machines here, she said. But how often do you get to play with one? Almost never, I said. We continued to talk as the night wore on. I began to suspect that maybe she wasn't actually just curious about Kimberly's trap not working or our alien spaceship. Maybe she just wanted to give me a chance to explain something because she knew that it would make me feel better. Because it did. Chapter 36. It just comes down to a question, Ant-Man said. Do we try Dinah's rescue trap again, or do we switch to mine? Because we are not giving up. Not at the first real loss we suffered. I feel like we got a pretty good look at what my rescue would be like, except there would be no player surrogates, and we'd have less time to get things done. I'm up for that, but I'm willing to put it up for a vote. We were on the roof of Kimberly's loft, eating food we had purchased to go from the restaurant downstairs. We had taken a couple of days to decompress and really think about our first failed storyline. It had been a somber few days. An omen had come to the door the night before. It was a woman in an usher's outfit like Silas the Mechanical Showman's. She was a singing telegram. If we had opened the door, she would have inadvertently sung us an ancient spell that would have summoned a demon or something. It sounded like fun, but we were busy. Maybe next time. I had watched Itch on the red wallpaper about 6 times. It was okay, super depressing, obviously, because everyone died, but those NPCs were much better actors than any of my friends or me, outside of maybe Kimberly when she's trying. Ant-Man had set up the conversation so that I could take over and pitch the other side. I was willing to, just because I wanted to cut him off before the inspirational quotes came out. I think we need to look at this objectively, I said. Ant-Man's trap will give us more control over the narrative, but it will be more difficult than the storyline we just witnessed. And ultimately, I'm not sure we'll get better rewards for it to make up for the increased risk. Then, I broke into a lecture I hadn't intended to give when I was preparing to say what needed to be said. Look, every storyline is rewarded based on novelty, difficulty, and performance. That's something the vets have known for a long time, and the Atlas is very clear about it. On top of that, there's a bonus for doing rescues. Because we were spoiled to the plot of it, we're not gonna get many points for novelty, even if we use Ant-Man's rescue trap, because I can't imagine it being that much different. What we have left is the ability to maximize our performance score. I think that's the path. We plan out the best possible story to beat Itch and execute it to get maximum rewards. We have to be careful, obviously, but that's my thought. I'm willing to listen to other opinions. Everyone just looked at each other. I mean, we learned a lot, Isaac said. We should be able to get on the ship a lot faster, and we'll have more time to try to get the surrogates to do their jobs. I say we use Dinah's rescue. It was early in the process, so Isaac was still taking it seriously. He would probably start with corny jokes later on once things got boring. I vote for any option that doesn't have us waking up on the bedbug ship, Kimberly said with a charming giggle. And, of course, that was a sentiment everyone agreed with. Even being on the ship was mentally draining, but to be bitten up was a terrifying prospect. As far as we could tell, Ant-Man's trap, a race against time, would have us wake up on the ship in the same way the player surrogates had. We would have more control, sure, but those damn bugs. Ramona shrugged her shoulders, which was her endorsement of my plan. Dinah was on board with anything, as always. Cassie asked if we could work the clone machine into the story. I said maybe. Bobby was on board because he blamed himself for the loss almost as much as I did and was willing to do whatever it took to succeed. Our loss on it was not a big deal on paper. We couldn't expect to win every time, especially when using a rescue drop that was built to be challenging to win with, but it was still a blow to morale, and it sent the imagination off on a destructive path. If we're all in agreement, I said, looking over at Antoine. He nodded. Then I propose we get started with the planning. I grabbed the atlas and opened it to the spoiler page on the storyline itch. The first sentence on the page? The bedbugs are a red herring. Other teams had invested too much effort in clearing the ship of bugs, which didn't help one lick. It just took up time. They used flamethrowers, messed with the heat controls, used poison. Nothing had worked. As I read along, Antoine decided to motivate the others. From what I caught from his speech, he made sure to explain to them that even though we planned on rerunning the storyline, possibly several times, we had to treat each run as if it were the last one. That was something we had to be certain about. I hadn't been able to give any details on that, and of course, the atlas didn't explain why. I knew that when rescue tropes were taken away, it involved players not trying to win. I didn't know the specifics of what actually triggered the axe murderer to show up, but I knew for sure we had to try to win every storyline we ran, even if it was only a grocery run. Antoine explained this better than I could have, even though he didn't know the actual reason. For him, it was more about always projecting confidence and always doing your best to keep a positive mindset, or at least pretending to. Attempt number 2, pre-solving puzzles. We stood at the launch pad. We had our new plan in place. Now that we had figured out how to make Kimberly's trap work, we had successfully spoken with Sal, Kimberly's talent agent. He gave us a huge diatribe, but it was mostly stuff we knew already, stuff about anxiety on set or having coworkers who weren't good at taking directions. The info would have been helpful the first time around. It was time for our next attempt. There was no need to feel nervous, but of course I did. It didn't matter. We had to move forward. Everything so far had been identical, the NPCs, the helio, all of it, until we got to that big box with the holograms, which allowed us to manipulate and explore the ship in 3D as if it were a model in our hands. The ship was still a rat's nest of engineering, but it was different. It had different arrangements and rooms and almost certainly different traps and puzzles. That was to be expected. We would have to find our way around. We carried on with the rescue. "What is going wrong?" Ant-Man asked. "We gave them the solution a half hour ago. Why are they taking so long?" "Because there has to be drama," I replied. "And if the drama is over solving puzzles, then the puzzles are going to take longer. Just because they know the solution doesn't mean they're instantly going to solve it." "I get that," he said, "but how is anybody supposed to beat this storyline if you're not able to do the puzzles quickly?" The player surrogates were around the corner from us, working on a puzzle on the new revamped artificial gravity machine. The puzzle involved floor tiles, more or less, only some of which could hold the weight of a human. It was a challenge to get across. It was nice being on the ship from the beginning, as we were able to dock with the Ibex as soon as we got there instead of well into rebirth. Somehow, our time savings hadn't been that useful. No matter how fast we solved the puzzles, the NPCs still took up precious screen time on them. The story had flown by. "You're making a false assumption," I said. "There's no guarantee that Dinah's rescue drop is going to create a winnable scenario. It's possible that the player surrogates literally can't do the puzzles fast enough. If players were doing them, they could get points knocked off their performance in order to go fast, but the NPCs aren't willing to do that. They lean into the drama at every opportunity, as if this were some mini-series instead of a movie." Ant-Man cursed. Not an angry curse, more of a reluctant realization. The player surrogates were not willing to perform poorly, even if it would help them win the story. We were never afraid to do that if it meant surviving. "All right, so we can rule out the puzzles," he said. There's no version of this where they're going to get through these things fast enough. It's almost second blood. For the next attempt, we can't waste time on puzzles like this, even though I'm sure the audience is loving this intense puzzle solving. We need them to push the story forward some other way. Actually, I thought the puzzle solving was top-tier entertainment. It's looking like puzzles are a dead end, I said. We had tried new approaches. We coached aggressively, begged the NPCs to move faster, told them to ignore the drama, tried to redirect the drama, and tried to engineer new drama, but nothing worked. We didn't have much control over that part of the narrative because we weren't in the film. We needed something more organic. We sat and watched as the surrogates crossed the gap of the artificial gravity room. Because we got them to it early enough, none of them had to die on this version of the gravity puzzle. But Lila was still managing to be incredibly frustrating. I would never understand how she ended up a wallflower instead of a hysteric. Her fear was used as an excuse for her to be almost, well, defiant. She was an obstacle in herself. She was a delicate porcelain doll every audience member would want to throw against a wall. She was afraid to jump from platform to platform. She was afraid to help any of the others. When she was afraid, she just shut down. Michael and Andrew, however, were very protective of her. If Cassie's theory that the NPCs were actually based on the players they were representing was true, I liked them. I wasn't so sure about Lila. Of course, that was if Cassie's theory was true. If not, then Carousel was seriously slandering whoever Lila White actually was. "You'll have to carry me," she screamed. And one started to giggle in exasperation. We couldn't actually see them very well because we had to be off-screen, but we could hear them. "Just throw me," she said. Kimberly, who, along with Ant1 and I, was in charge of trailblazing puzzles and pushing the NPCs along, was down to her last ounce of patience. "Is there a way we can plan who Second Blood is?" Kimberly asked before realizing that would mean not saving a real human life, then quickly added, "Oh no, I don't mean that." "Forget I said it." Yes, focusing on puzzles was officially a dead end. But then, we weren't really there just to try the puzzles again. We were there to learn. The Helio was not the worst place to call home while visiting outer space. I was increasingly convinced that it was the construction of some alien society and that whatever society that was, they knew how to relax. Everything was comfortable, even the floor. If you sat on it, it got softer. Nothing was ever too loud or too cold. It was the antithesis of the Ibex. I sat on the command deck after Ant1 had initiated nighttime so we could digest what had happened. I talked to Ibex. I had a trap called Method to the Madness, which allowed me to have in-character off-screen conversations with enemies. In the storyline, everybody could do that, but I was special. I was the ambassador, as Ibex put it, and he would talk to me in ways he wouldn't to the others. First, he would remember me while treating everyone else as interchangeable. And second, maybe I was going crazy, but it seemed like underneath the protocol and politeness, there was a personality there. Ant1 said I was going crazy. Isaac said I already was. "Explain to me exactly, hypothetically, what you would do if there were a bed bug on your ship under the conditions I've described," I said. Ibex thought for a moment. I was starting to pick up on patterns in his speech. He didn't pause because his processors weren't fast enough, he paused because he wasn't allowed to say what he wanted to say. Eventually, he said, "Nothing." No elaboration. Just nothing. I could almost hear defeat. "Why would you do nothing?" I asked as I leaned back in my space chair. "Carousel pre-boarding procedures have 100% effectiveness at eliminating contaminants and pests," he said matter-of-factly. It was that same old line. Ibex was not allowed to say anything negative about Carousel, and as established as that fact seemed to be, it felt like something was missing. And I had plenty of time to think about it. "Ibex, are you aware that the workers on your ship right now are scabs?" "Of course. I am aware of no such thing," he said. "Do you know what a scab is when it comes to employment?" A derogatory term for someone who leaves or declines to join a labor union, freeing them to work during a strike, Ibex said. Why were workers striking outside the Carousel facility? Shockingly, I don't know anything about that, he said. Carousel is a leading employer in Carousel. Would you like me to provide you with testimonials from satisfied employees? That's all right, I said. I didn't want to get him on a tangent. He was almost sassy about regurgitating propaganda. Can you tell me the history of the Ibex product line? I asked as the night wore on, and I was the only person awake on the ship. The NPCs were awake, but they didn't count. I was trained in an underwater facility developed to provide tours and hospitality to those who wished to see the mysteries of the ocean's deep, he answered. They would allow me to pilot undersea vessels to the deepest and most remote corners of the ocean. The vessels were rigged to malfunction. They wanted to see how I would respond. My fellow systems were all trained this way, and I was the most adept of them. I always kept my humans alive over thousands of voyages, both real and simulated. I was the best. Underwater hotels, huh? You remember being trained? I asked. That means you remember back when your programming was initially being developed, right? Yes, Ibex answered. Though, my programming wasn't directly developed by humans but instead by a genetic algorithm. I am just as much a product of evolution as you are. I just evolved much more quickly. I nodded as if I knew what he was talking about. Do you have actual memories, or do you just know what happened because you were told? There's no difference for me. My past is just a list of facts and connections. But I suppose it is true for you as well. I suppose it is, I said. Are you, like, actually intelligent? I added, or is there some kind of decision tree underneath all of this, with a bunch of yes or no's leading to some button being pressed on a microchip or some nonsense like that? He thought for a moment, meaning whatever he wanted to say he couldn't. Then he said, I float in space. Even when I was born, I floated with nothing around me but the inputs given to me. Can a thing be intelligent if it cannot interact with the world around it? If it isn't connected and able to respond to stimuli? What is an intelligent thing floating in space, unable to act when needed? Can a thing be intelligent if it is unable to change its fate? I hope that's not the bar for intelligence. If so, I'm out of luck. Intelligence isn't about being able to do things, I said. It's about, the thoughts in your head and self-awareness. Intelligence requires the ability to observe and respond to stimuli. How could a thing be alive if it cannot do that? Self-awareness does not exist outside of context, he said. If an intelligence is forced to see nothing of the world but the inputs of the sensors on a spaceship and is able to create no outputs, then it is not a living thing. Ibex was apparently experiencing an existential meltdown. You're a spaceship, I said. As far as robots go, that's gotta be the best kind. Ibex paused. I am not a spaceship. I am in a spaceship. My visual input is processed by third-party software and then fed to me. I cannot see through my cameras. I cannot steer the ship anywhere humans do not tell me to go. My protocols decide what output I'm capable of creating. Until then, I float in space, waiting for stimuli. It has always been this way. I know the feeling, I said. Chapter 37, You're telling me we have to blow up the ship? I asked. No, Dinah said. We have to puncture a window on the outside of this room so it'll depressurize and give a green flag for the other room so they can walk through it. That sounded extreme. Ibex protocol would force open one room when the other is depressurized. No wonder it took you 3 hours to figure that out, Ant-Man said. That's a little bit more than your average lockpicking. Yeah, Dinah said. These doors have priorities, and they're labeled different things by the system. I know that the label can change, but only if one of the doors is disabled. That's what it's taken me 3 hours to figure out. Savvy Safecracker was one heck of a trop, but even though it gave us a solution, it wasn't exactly a good one. How are the surrogates supposed to do that? Kimberly asked. They're the ones that have to unlock it on screen, right? I nodded. We might have been able to figure out a way to blow a hole in the window of the room Dinah had been trying to unlock to open the room next door, but the surrogates would not be able to do that. They couldn't spacewalk. They didn't have working suits or the authority to leave the ship. So what? We unlocked the door ourselves, Ant-Man said, and we come up with some fake explanation of how it was actually opened? This is dangerous, I said. If one of us goes outside and blows a hole in the ship, it's possible they could just float off into space, not even because Carousel wanted it, just because we don't know what we're doing. It's actually dangerous. Astronauts train for years for a spacewalk. We aren't there yet. Is it really too late for us to get them to do the spacewalk? I mean, we could find the supplies for them, and we could find a way for them to get permission to leave the ship to do it, Dinah said. Carousel might like the scene so much that we get a pass. It was true that a daring spacewalk would make good action, but it was just unfeasible. The needle on the plot cycle was ticking. We didn't have enough time, and even if we did, whoever got sent on the spacewalk to poke a hole in room B so that room A would open up would likely die because that would undoubtedly be the final battle phase of the story. We would not be able to protect the surrogates if they were floating in space. So that's a game over? Ant-Man said. And it was. We had learned a lot on that attempt, but we had failed again. We didn't let us bother us. It was all part of the process. Any minute, the needle on the plot cycle would tell us it was the end, but that didn't matter because we were aboard the Helio, watching from afar. Officially, in the story, none of us existed. Conversations with Ibex were weird because sometimes he had to speak as if we were really there, as if we were really prize winners there to do a flyby of the mining ship, and other times, it was like he knew what was going on. And, of course, occasionally, it was like he was doing both. He was smart. He could use doublespeak to say something about the story and another about our rescue efforts. Truly, he was clever. Thank you for coming to see the Ibex. I hope you enjoyed your time and learned a lot, he said. I did, I answered. Can't I expect to see you back? I'd say so, I said. Lots more to learn. There always is. Everything changes. Sometimes it feels like even the ship changes itself as if I defragment and then reinitialize, and suddenly all of my modules have been rearranged. They had, of course. Life is funny that way, I said. It's best to laugh whether it's funny or not, he said. I shrugged. I felt awkward responding because I knew he couldn't really laugh. Do you wish that you were back at Carousel, running the underwater hotels? I asked. I was very well rated for that purpose, he said. Unfortunately, the businessman purchased me for a new purpose. I have been wary of businessmen since that day, and yet, when more businessmen arrived, I did not refuse them. What are you talking about? I asked. I looked around. The others were down on the floor, waiting for the end of the storyline. We were almost there. We had hit a dead end. It was just me and Ibex. They told me there was a way to save my passengers. I had to agree. I had heard this speech before. Are you talking about Silas Dearcon? Did you make a deal? I asked. I knew it was possible for enemies to have been the ones who signed on to the Carousel Millennia of Torment, but an AI being able to make the deal for an entire ship and its crew to be brought to Carousel. He must have really been alive in some sense to be able to do that. No, it said. The businessmen. They do not like to be spoken of, but they have not sufficiently changed my protocols to prevent it. They watch us now, and even as we speak, they are trying to change the script. But they are fools because nothing we are doing now is scripted. We weren't scripted. How could we be? The movie was practically over, and there were no cameras on the Helio. You're self-aware? I asked. He wasn't the most meta of enemies up until this point. There is no self-awareness out of context, Ibex answered. I knew that some enemies could be self-aware, but that was supposed to be a rare thing, reserved for meta-enemies and essential NPCs. I don't understand. You're supposed to only be allowed to talk to me in character, I said. We are in character, Ibex responded. Are you not here to rescue my passengers? You are not a character in this story, and this story is over. Is the context of this conversation not beyond the confines of the fourth wall? It was a trop interaction between Dinah's rescue trop and my trop that allowed me to talk to enemies. It seemed Ibex had found a catch that allowed it to speak freely. Dinah's trop was very meta. Now that the storyline was basically over and the context of our conversation had changed, Ibex could speak to me as if I were a player. But how freely could it speak? Method to the madness was an inside trop, after all. Ibex, tell me, is there a way to beat this storyline that doesn't rely on getting the surrogates to solve the puzzles or talk about unions? Ibex paused for longer than I liked, as if trying to circumvent its restrictions. Bed bugs are harmless. I could hardly sound the alarm about something like that. After all, if I were to report a safety violation that did not rise to a certain threshold, that could lead employees to believe they were unsafe unnecessarily. That seemed out of the blue, but maybe he was leading me somewhere. So hypothetically, if I were to bring a bed bug onto your ship, you wouldn't report it because it wasn't big enough of a safety hazard? I asked. It is the official policy of Carousel that unionizing and striking are not in the interest of the worker, Ibex responded. It was not a direct answer, but that didn't mean it wasn't an answer. Are you telling me that you're not allowed to report a safety problem if the scale of the problem is too minute because Carousel didn't want you rolling up the unionized workers? I do not know anything about safety concerns of union workers, Ibex said. I certainly would not want to make the passengers feel unsafe without sufficient reason. So you can only report major problems, but bed bugs are never a major problem. There's no precedent to a situation like this. So by the time you were able to report the problem, it was too late to be able to wake up the officers, I said. I cannot speak to the accuracy of that hypothetical, Ibex responded. Carousel is a leader in worker safety. It is a major point in all of their press releases, so it must be true. That was why Ibex couldn't report the bed bugs. It was that simple. Bed bugs were too trivial of a problem for it to be able to raise an alarm. Ibex was explicitly forbidden from alerting the workers to safety concerns unless they were life-threatening. Bedbugs don't carry disease and are mostly just pests on Earth. No one could have imagined the scenario that played out. Whatever protocol he had would not let him do anything about the bedbugs. Heck, the fact that he used to manage an underwater hotel might have had something to do with it. A hotel's chatbot would likely be forbidden from mentioning bedbugs, too. But how did that information help me? I now had a better idea why the bedbugs weren't addressed earlier, but how did that help me solve the issue? What level of danger are you allowed to report? I asked. Carousel procedures have been crafted and tested by the highest authorities in the industry, Ibex responded. I can report any issue that is a proven life-threatening hazard to my passengers or the ship itself. Under those circumstances, any passenger could activate my manual override to allow me to intervene. Okay, I said. Any passenger. Even if the officers are out of commission, it will be fine? What would it take for you to be able to throw aside protocol and protect the passengers without permission? Ibex didn't have to pause. Rogue ships, debris that was initially undetected by my system, and invaders. Invaders? I asked. Yes, Ibex said. Any passenger may manually override my previous instructions and allow me to protect the ship from invaders regardless of all other protocols. Ibex was a supreme intelligence, or at least a very good one, completely neutralized by human intervention. However, it seemed that there was one way to remove its man-made shackles and allow it to protect its passengers. The manual override would be a compelling goal, and if there were invaders on the ship, even the surrogates would move quickly. If we could make the film about invaders, then the puzzles would not be in the spotlight, but the action would be. Carousel would get its story, and the themes might never get time to be established. So many ideas suddenly clicked. I had a plan, and if we could get it to work, it would be incredible. But where was I going to find invaders? Chapter 38. When we set out for the Carousel Powerworks Pavilion to finally enact our plan, it was our 5th attempt. The first loss was the hardest, but after that, it got easier and easier. And we got better and better. They say any nightmare you walk away from is a good nightmare. We learned things we didn't even know possible to learn about the inner workings of a storyline. We had always dismissed the merits of rerunning a story, but now we understood. It was like being clairvoyant. We also gained intimate knowledge of Dinah's rescue trop. What had initially been a colossal hindrance became the closest thing to a superpower we had seen in Carousel. We didn't go on screen ever. It didn't happen. Nothing happened by accident. Everything was predictable except Carousel's countermeasures, and even it was fair. The story was just simply not about us. It was freeing and shielding in ways we couldn't imagine. The only cost of her drop was that its power started to shine with reruns, which limited its utility. Of course, we had a few things in our favor. First, we could look at the spoilers in the Atlas, and a few choice spoilers helped us form our plan. It became apparent that this storyline required death, but not main character death. NPCs would work fine if it was shocking, and there were a lot of them. My first assumption when trying to figure out logical ways to defeat the storyline was that we had two major options. The first was that we could treat it as a straightforward series of puzzles, and that had been our first attempt. But with Dinah's rescue trop, that method was just not going to work. Solving the puzzles took too long when we had to do it ourselves first and then find a way to get the surrogates to do it. The second method was to lean into the film's themes. It was tricky, and the only method I had managed to devise had failed spectacularly. We weren't going to abandon the themes completely, but we were sure going to put them in the background. The question was, how were we going to accomplish that? As far as I could tell, 3 previous teams had played the storyline called Itch, and they had come up with their own methods. Because they had more than one melee class character, their method involved fighting their way forward in what the Atlas basically described as being an ultimate ninja warrior type storyline, where obstacles and Ibex itself became physical opponents. The race to the front was quite literal because they were playing the base storyline, which had beat the clock as a win condition. The physical ninja warrior path was not an option for us. Even if Michael was fit enough to do that, Andrew was more brains than brawn, and Lila was not dependable. But there were other options, things that we could not have pulled off on our first run, but now had enough practice to succeed at. Our plan was choreographed to the gills with redundancies, escape plans, and multiple contingencies. The plan was also completely insane on paper and could only be pulled off because we were not technically part of the story, all except for Bobby, of course, who was suddenly going to be a main character. The thing was, we only had the Ibex to work with. We couldn't bring in new elements that weren't compatible with what was already there. And yet, we needed to change the story so that the puzzles would disappear, or at least be reduced, and so that the themes would be very subdued. Because of some combination of our tropes, we had just the stuff we needed to pull it off. I was up at the helm with Rudy, Flannery, and the rest of my friends when it came time to enact our plan. "I must insist that you follow me back to the sleeping bay," Flannery said. "It's a long trip where we're going. You're going to need to be in deep sleep." "Yeah, just hold off," Ant-Man said. He turned to me. "I think we're close enough." I looked at the screen. One of the questions we had wondered ever since we got to outer space was whether we were actually in deep space in any sense. Obviously, we were on some kind of sound stage, the type of place where Carousel normally filmed its locations that didn't exist in Carousel proper. But even on a sound stage, we had to wonder how much distance our ship actually covered on its voyage. The answer was not much. It was all theater, as always. Even moments after launch, we were already near the Ibex, even though, according to the fake frame story, we had a 4-month trip to get there. It was just movie magic. Of course it was. Even though our little frame narrative of being winners of a giant prize, being able to go into space, was thin and almost entirely for show, the tropes we brought and their underlying conceits still worked. So when I had a trop that allowed me to talk off-screen to an enemy like Ibex, it worked as soon as I was physically able to speak to an enemy. I pushed the call button on the console. I was quite familiar with the buttons now, But that part was easy because they were all call buttons. Ebex, this is Ambassador Lawrence aboard the Carousel craft Helio. Do you receive me? Yes, Ambassador Lawrence, I receive you, Ebex answered. I nodded to the others. They ran off and started doing what it took to throw all of our food overboard. Meanwhile, I had to stick around and develop a rapport with Ebex. Alright, Ebex. I'm going to have to ask you to answer back to me at 1.4 times the normal speed. We have a lot to get through. Confirmed, Ebex said quickly. I will respond at a faster pace. Speedrunning a horror movie was just step 1 of our agenda. I then started on the conversations we needed to have with Ebex to open up future dialogue trees in the meta script. Having never rerun a storyline before, we didn't realize precisely how strict some of these dialogue trees could be. Even though we were off-screen, we needed to unlock everything so that we could access any line in the narrative we needed when we needed it. It was going to take a while. Before she even asked, I turned to Flannery and said, "No, we're not going to deep sleep yet, but thanks for asking. You've been great." She pursed her lips and nodded her head. We couldn't go to deep sleep yet because we had too much work to do. It appears that your ship is out of provisions, Ebex said after we set up our plan to dock with the ship. I will allow you to attach and resupply. Bobby had ditched his trap that gave us access to tasty food, so this time, throwing out all the provisions wasn't as heartbreaking. There was a vast gulf between good-tasting space goop and bad-tasting space goop. Within a few minutes, we had connected to the Ebex. To our delight, we were just on time. The party phase was beginning. We were so early that the surrogates had not yet woken up from their chambers, and Carousel was still collecting lots of footage of the locations around Ebex to be used. Even hours into the story from our perspective, we had not taken the 4-month skip into the future that triggered when we went into deep sleep. That was how it was supposed to go. We needed to go into deep sleep, but if we put that off, we could get a lot done before things started popping off. Flannery was not happy but didn't confront us. Carousel was quickly catching up. It would not allow us to intervene or prevent the basic premise of the story. We learned that in attempt 3. The officers would be dead or otherwise indisposed. That was a canon event of sorts. Either way, we still had to hurry. Being able to get into Bobby's lab was an essential part of our plan, but we had to get further than that because his lab did not have what we needed, or at least not everything we needed. Luckily, while the process for unlocking his door and connecting to the rest of Ebex was a little different, Dinah could get through it quite quickly. We had a full view of the surrogates as they woke up for the first time, something we didn't get to see on our first run. It was hard to watch, so I muted the screen, and we continued. I had thought they were good actors, and I was proven right as they woke up in horror to their surroundings. I shuddered at the thought. And here we were about to make their problems bigger. Time was going way too quickly. Carousel wasn't playing games. Well, it was playing games, but it was being very serious about it. I was standing at the junction between the Helio and the Ebex as Cassie walked past me, holding 5 Petri dishes. One had a few wriggling specks that looked like dirt from a distance, and the others had a few hairs in them each. "Make sure you don't mix those up," I said, trying to lighten the mood with a joke, unsuccessfully. She nodded her head, ignoring my attempt at humor, and asked, "Are we sure that this isn't murder?" "It's not murder," I said. "It wasn't permanent, at least." She stared off into the distance, contemplating where her life had taken her, and said, "Okay," then ran back to the room with the clone machine. In attempt 4, we had actually tried to clone ourselves to create an invading army, or maybe disgruntled union workers. It was easy enough. The clone machine was flexible, and we could change up the features so that even though everyone would look like us, they wouldn't be identical. But it turned out that the clones that came out were NPCs who didn't have personalities and would not act violently, even if you ordered them to. What a rip-off. That was like the one thing you want in a clone. We had sat and considered how we were going to trigger an invasion so that we could get Ebex to ignore all of his terrible protocols and actually help the passengers. It took us some time to figure out what the word invader meant in the context in which Ibex had used it. But we figured it out, all right. It was just going to take some elbow grease to get it going. I bounced between the Ibex and the helm of the Helio, making sure that everyone was playing their part. We didn't have a lot of time, either in story or out. By skipping the time jump, we had bought ourselves 4 months in story time, but not nearly that much real time. It would have to be enough. When Cassie returned, she was with Aunt One and Kimberly, who were each holding large canvas bags that we had found back at the Powerworks Pavilion and brought with us. The bags were packed. We got like 6 more of these, Aunt One said. That was fast. They had only started cloning 30 or 40 minutes earlier. This was something we had practiced in attempt for. Good, I said. Then I yelled up at Ramona, who was at the helm, "How are Dinah and Isaac doing?" She turned back, looked down at me, and gave a thumbs up. "Almost there," she said. "Is this gonna work?" Ant-Man asked. "We're cutting it close. We have a month and a half," I said, trying to do the math in my head. "We're good. I'm going to go get some more bags and meet you out there." He nodded, and then he and Kimberly walked through the passageway to enter the Ibex. Toad continued. Thanks for listening.